Hello and welcome to Free Grace Bible Study. Before we jump into it today, I want to remind you to go to freegrace.in. You can get subscribed so that you'll see future episodes of not only this show, but the other shows and podcasts that we do. So today on Free Grace Bible Study, we're going to talk about John chapter 2. And chapter 2 is when the excitement really begins to take off for me in the Gospel of John, because Jesus starts to do miraculous things. Now, in the beginning, he doesn't do it real obvious to everybody at first. He has what we might call a more private miracle, and we'll see that in a moment. But before we get to that, I want to remind you about the purpose statement of the Gospel of John. He comes in this verse block in 20, 30, and 31. Specifically, I'm going to look at 31 here, where it says, "But these are written," talking about the Gospel of John, is written, "so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in His name." So if you want eternal life that comes from Jesus, then you must believe in His name. You must believe in Him for that free gift. And that's going to become important toward the end of the story that we're going to read today. So this is chapter 2, verse 1. Notice what the apostle says about the incident that happened. "On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there." Okay, so Cana is north. We were in Judea, that's in the south, where Jerusalem is, and the Judean countryside that surrounds it. That's in the south of the country. Now, Galilee is in the north, north of Samaria specifically. So now we've sort of jumped some geography and jumped a little bit of time. So you'll remember it told us that Jesus wanted to go to Galilee. He gathered up Philip and then Nathanael, and John and Andrew and Peter were along as well. And so we assume, it doesn't tell us specifically, but we assume at least those disciples were with Jesus at this point, because this story is going to reference Jesus' disciples. And it tells us that they wind up in Cana of Galilee. Now, Galilee is the home area of Jesus, Peter, Andrew, James, John, Nathanael, and probably some others, but it's the home territory of them. Now, they didn't come from Cana. That's a little bit farther away from their hometown, but they're from this area, so it's kind of like coming home. So I'm from Texas. I'm from Longview, but it'd be sort of like coming to, say, Tyler, Texas. That still feels kind of like home, even though I'm not quite to my hometown. Okay, so they're in Cana, and it tells us that Jesus' mother was at a wedding. Now, I take this to mean that she was involved in planning the wedding, and it makes it sound like Jesus' mother was already there, and then Jesus and His disciples show up after, maybe as it begins. But it seems like Jesus' mother is involved in helping them organize this wedding, and you'll see why I say that in a second. Verse 2, "Now both Jesus and His disciples were invited to the wedding." So it says that Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and His disciples were invited. So it seems like Jesus' mother has more of a role. Verse 3, "And when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to Him, 'They have no more wine.'" Now, doesn't this make it sort of seem like Mary, Jesus' mother, is involved somehow in the wedding planning? Because otherwise, why would she be concerned? So she comes to Jesus, and it seems as if she knows there's something special about Jesus, and maybe she just recognizes that He's a get-it-done kind of guy, or maybe she is referring to the fact that He is the Creator. We don't really know what her knowledge base and knowledge level about Jesus was at this point, but suffice it to say, she's more aware than most that there is something very special about Jesus because of the way in which He was born and what was revealed to Mary and Joseph. So Mary knows that He is the Messiah. She probably knows that His time to reveal Himself has not yet come, but she comes to Him with her problems. And I think there's an image here of how our Christian life ought to be, even though the wedding party running out of wine could be considered kind of a small thing in the grand scheme of things. Mary does what she's supposed to, which is to bring her problems to Jesus. Cast your cares on him and he will care for you. And so Mary does that. She brings her problems to Jesus and just basically lays it at his feet. And it's like, what can you do about this? Now notice how Jesus responds. Jesus said to her, "Woman." Now, if I said "woman" to my mom, that would be considered rude. But just trust me here, linguistically and culturally, the way that he says this, the word that he uses isn't disrespectful. He's being respectful here. This was a way that a son would talk to a mother. "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." Now again, he's not being rude here. He's just stating the fact that it's not time for him to reveal himself as the Messiah to the masses. And so what it seems like he's getting at here is that he's letting her know that whatever he does, he's not going to do it publicly, that it's going to be a bit of a secret. And in fact, it almost feels like he's saying, "Hey, Mom, let's keep this between you and me. I'll take care of it, but my time has not yet come." And he's sort of saying that it really would be okay for him to not do anything. Because notice he says, "What does your concern have to do with me?" Well, here's the thing, and I think there's some irony here. All concerns that we have to do with Jesus. And I think maybe he's bringing attention to that fact that if you have a concern, you ought to bring it to Jesus. And I think he's saying this to maybe kind of bring up this point that whatever concern you have, he is willing to do something, even though it maybe doesn't fit into his reveal himself to the masses plan. He is still willing to do something for his mother and for a small group of people. And I think that makes this, what is about to happen, even more special. So his mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." Now this is why I think he's saying that he'll do something, but he wants to kind of keep it quiet, because she realizes that he's willing to take action, and he's about to. And so she goes to the servants. I mean, she's not like, "Oh, Jesus isn't going to do anything based on what he said." She knows he's going to do something. So then she goes to the servants and she tells them that, "Hey, Jesus is in charge. Do what he says." Yet again, we see something very special from Mary here, a lesson that I think is really worth us thinking about, which is whatever Jesus says, do it. I mean, it's kind of like that phrase from the late 90s, early 2000s that Nike used. It was "just do it." Here, we could have a t-shirt that says, "Whatever Jesus says to you, do it." I think that's a really great lesson for us. I don't know that it's the main lesson of this story, but I think if we lived by that mantra, then our lives would be a lot easier. It makes me think of my son. Every morning when we're getting ready for school, I find myself pretty often saying, "Hey, Bubba, have you obeyed what Mama told you to do? Did you get your water bottle ready? Did you get your snack ready?" And often I find myself just saying, if Mama says it, you just need to do it. And in the same way, I think that's true of whatever Jesus says to us. So let's look at verse 6. "Now there were set there 6 water pots of stone." So it'd be easy to read over this and not recognize what this is, but those 6 water pots made of stone, there's a clue in that those water pots were for special use. The fact that they're made of stone, there was a Jewish belief that stone couldn't be contaminated by religious contamination or ceremonial contamination. And so they're made of stone. And then notice it says, according to the manner of purification for the Jews. And so this was a purification method where they would wash in 6 different pots. Now, it's valuable to know that the Old Testament purification laws, they did tell Jews to wash, but they didn't tell them to do it this obsessively, to have the 6 different things. This was kind of an over the top. And so what the Pharisees did is they took the law and they added onto it, and they added lots of extra rules. They sort of built a hedge around the law so that people couldn't even approach breaking the law. And so this was one of those things where they had taken what God said and they had added layers of legalism on top of it. And so this purification rites, it was important for Jews to wash according to the law, but they had taken it to the nth. They had taken it to the nth degree. Now there were set there 6 water pots of stone according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. So these are big. A 20-gallon pot of water would be quite a bit. I mean, it would be a pretty big pot, and there were 6 of those. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water," which, by the way, would be a pretty big job, because, that's a lot of water to carry. So this took a little while for them to fill those if they were empty completely. We don't know if they were completely empty, but he wanted them completely filled. And they filled them up to the brim. So they brought the water level all the way up. And he said to them, "Draw some now and take it to the master of the feast." And they took it. Now, at this point, nobody knows what Jesus is up to. I mean, they're obeying him because Mary told them to, which tells us once again that Mary must have been in charge of something, and now she's transferred her authority over to Jesus, which is, again, a great lesson from Mary. And so they just do this whole thing. They filled it up with water, and then they take the water to the master of the feast. So, verse 9, when the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and by the way, that's the statement that this is a miracle. It's so understated here. Jesus just fundamentally changed the molecular nature of a substance, and it doesn't even really do any pomp and circumstance in the text. It just sort of says it kind of almost as a byword, as just as a circumstance. It says that the water had been made wine, and the master of the feast did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew. The master of the feast called the bridegroom. So here we have Jesus revealing himself through a miracle, not to the most important guests, but to the servants, and also to those, his disciples, who knew what was going on behind the scenes. Yet again, I think we have some symbolism here, that he was revealing himself to the lowly, to those who weren't the most educated, to those who were actually servants. And I think that very well becomes part of how he operates, is that the lowly who are willing to come to him are the ones who receive the most of him, who receive the most information, they receive the most relationship. And so here, the servants, because they obeyed, they got to see behind the curtain, so to speak, and got to know what Jesus was doing, what Jesus was all about here. Verse 10, and he said to him, "Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine." So this is the master of the feast speaking. "Every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have drunk, when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior." So what he's saying is, you bring out your good stuff at the beginning while the party is getting started, and then once everybody's a little bit inebriated, you can get by with lesser quality wine. You have a little bit of watered down wine. Now this is why this is important, is that the master of the feast is verifying that the wine that came from the water pots is not watered down, because that's how they would have done it. They would have had some wine and then they would have added water and made it weaker. He's saying this stuff is strong. This stuff is potent. And so Jesus didn't take some wine and then cut it with a bunch of water. He fundamentally made concentrated, powerful wine here, and that's, I think, why the comments of the master of the feast are included, and also that Jesus makes good things. Jesus didn't make an inferior product here. He made good things. And the master of the feast says, "You have kept the good wine until now." Now, verse 11 is the wrap-up of this story, and it's important to us. This beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifest his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So there's a couple of layers here. First of all, what we have is it tells us that Jesus manifest his glory, or he showed off his glory here. But notice he doesn't show it off to the masses. He doesn't show it off even to all the guests at this fairly small wedding party. He shows it off to his disciples, his mother, and the servants. And so those who are in closest relationship to him are the ones who received the most information and the most of the inside look. And this harkens back to what we saw in chapter 1, where the Apostle John wrote that we saw his glory. And so now this is the setup to show how the apostles saw his glory all through the Gospel of John. Now notice what we have at the very end there, and his disciples believed in him. Now we know that some of the disciples already believed in him in chapter 1. We had Andrew, we had John, we had Peter, we had Philip and Nathaniel at least, who believed in him in chapter 1. So is it possible that other disciples are here now and they believed for the first time? Maybe so. Or is it possible that he's saying that they had believed in him already, that those 5 had believed in him already, but now they believed something new about him? Well, either way, here's what we know, that by this point in chapter 2, they had believed in him as the Christ. Because that's the shorthand for what he's saying there. Remember John 20, 30, and 31? But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believing you may have life in his name. So what we have in chapter 2, and this is almost at the beginning of the book, chapter 1 and chapter 2 show us that the disciples, those who were close to him, those to whom he had revealed himself, they believed in him. So in chapter 2, we have a statement that those disciples, they had everlasting life because they had believed in him. And that's going to be important as we go forward. You see, the disciples didn't know everything about Jesus at this point, but they knew enough to have everlasting life because they believed in him for the fact that he was the Christ, and that means the giver of everlasting life. Well, thanks for watching this episode. We'll take a look at Jesus in the temple in the next episode of Free Grace Bible Study. Thanks for being with me. I'll be back with you soon.